Cheers. I'm Joanne Bundy, and the Planning Committee joins me in welcoming you all to the Bucket Courses Open Wednesday program. And a special welcome to Suzanne Rodinius, because she's sharing her birthday with us today. Happy birthday, Suzanne. I am always amazed at how the professors who come to teach the bucket courses go to great trouble to work out their schedules so that they can accommodate our invitations. And at your request, we invited Mike Guenther to come and do a 4-week course, but his schedule didn't permit that. And however, he did work it out so that he could do an Open Wednesday for us. So we are very happy to have Professor of History at Grinnell College, Mike Guenther, and do you know your type, Mike?
Thank you so much. It's a real delight to be back here. It's been a few years since I've given a bucket course. And I also want to say that it's a real special treat for me because my parents are in the audience. Ben and Arlene Guenther moved here to Grinnell, and so this is the first time I've been in front of them. It makes me a little nervous. And it's also a special treat because my uncle Rob is here, who is flown in from Denver just because he loves typography. But I haven't got to say this to him as much, but I really appreciate it over the years. He's made enormous efforts to come to be a part of my life and my brother's life by flying from Denver to when we lived in Hampton, Virginia. And he was at my high school graduation, my college graduation. So I really appreciate all the effort that you've made and coming all this way. So it's a real pleasure to have you here as well. This is a subject that I have a long-standing interest in. I was talking to Burl a second ago, and he said, are you going to explain why you've been interested in this? And I hadn't really worked that into the talk. Maybe I should have to begin with. I was going to start with Steve Jobs, but myself, I think I trace it back sometimes to record labels, and to things growing up as a kid, just seeing all the different type out there. I grew up near a NASA facility, and I remember when they switched their logo to the, I don't know if any of you know NASA's worm logo. It's this kind of like hippie 70s kind of thing. It was a kind of a controversy at the time. They went from their old logo to the new one. In fact, when I was growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, the government had a whole program to redesign the typefaces for all of the government agencies to make them modern, attractive, visually appealing. And so I think those things kind of stuck in my mind over the years. And then a lot of what I'll talk about today is kind of the great age of type in the 17th and 18th century, which is the period of history I study. And I hadn't thought much about type in that sense until I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And I read everything on microfilm, really horrible copies. It's bad for your eyes. It's nothing pleasurable. When I was at the Bodleian, they give you the original text. So I was reading works, from the 17th century and seeing them in the original paper, feeling engraved text, you can actually feel the imprints. It was a totally different experience. And so it kind of rekindled my interest. And a lot of the people I study in the 17th and 18th century, people like Ben Franklin, Jefferson, they were all interested in type design themselves because it captured to them what was all about the Enlightenment, blending art and science to make a more pleasing, more educational and uplifting world. And so that's a lot to put on type itself. But I hope to kind of maybe today convince you or maybe to show you why I got interested in it, because there's all these really intricacies about how it's designed, how it reflects the values of an era. And also maybe to make you interested, and you're going to be surrounded by type all your life. You already have been, so it might make your life more interesting when you're waiting in rooms, waiting rooms to look at type and kind of decide what it is, why it might please you, why it might not. So I just thought I'd start with this kind of fun periodic table of type that was done by the American Typographical Society of 100 and I can't remember now, 13 or something like that, types that they thought were either highly influential, beautiful, or sometimes notorious. There's a few on here like OCR type. I don't think is anyone's favorite, but it's been very important. So instead I was going to start with Steve Jobs, a person that we think about with the world of technology, computing. A lot of people might think the man who in some ways destroyed the world of type and books, in some ways, right? The world that we have now today of Twitter and things like that. But Steve Jobs himself talked a lot about how one of his most formative experiences was studying calligraphy and type as an undergraduate. And so I wanted to just read to you from a convocation speech that he gave at Stanford. And he was talking about his early career as an undergraduate at Reed College, which he dropped out of. And he said, and I'm quoting Steve Jobs, "Reed College at the time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, even posters, or every poster, every label, on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle, in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating." And he goes on to say, "None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have had them. If I had never dropped out, I would never have dropped in on this calligraphy class. And personal computing might not have the wonderful typography that they do today." And this was part of a larger thing that Steve Jobs would always emphasize, which is computing and the IT revolution was as much about design and creativity as it was about engineering. I mean, you did have to have engineering, and he himself kind of studied science, but you have to have that artistic side as well. And that's something that, to me, I find fascinating about typography. I want to talk a little bit today, is about how it's a world that blends art and science, engineering and creativity, and how every era has tried to capture that challenge, or strike that balance in a different way. So I thought I'd start with, the person to begin with, Gutenberg, and the invention of movable type here. Other people had done woodcut block printings and other things, but what really was unique about Gutenberg was not so much his press, although being a son of a winemaker, it kind of made sense in a region. But other people had decided or had thought about that you could press something onto a piece of paper to make engraving. But I want to emphasize that what made him different was type, movable type, and the way he designed it. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but it is quite interesting. What he decided to do was to create a world in which you could make hundreds, if not thousands, of cheap, highly detailed typefaces that you could put in a row movably into a plate or sort and print. And so the way to do that was that he would first carve, and he himself carved this. He was related to the goldsmithing guild, so he was trained in kind of the arts of engraving and metalworking. And a lot of this had to do with kind of finding the right metal that could be durable enough to uphold printing, but flexible enough to be easily melted and easily cast and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff. And the same thing with ink. We don't really even know how he did it, but he created these lead-based inks that were totally unlike anything that were used in the Middle Ages, water-based inks. And so a lot of what made printing work was, again, not just the printing press, but these really intricate design skills in terms of making type that was, as we'll try to see in its day, considered beautiful. But so you would start by carving the letter on a punch. You would then use the punch to make an inverse engraving in what was called the matrix. Then the matrix would be slipped into a kind of horsehair and dung mold. And then the hot metal would be poured into the mold, producing the type itself, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a complicated 3 or 4 step process, but what it allows you to do is to make a set of alphabet punches, and then from that make hundreds and hundreds of quick, easy to make types that you can sell to people. More importantly, when they start to wear down, you can just melt them down and recast them in a matter of minutes. So this is one of the keys to kind of Gutenberg's success. And then just, because I think there's actually a lot of interesting language that comes out of the world of originally setting type. The creation of letters are in what are called sorts. And so our phrase that we have today when someone says, "I'm out of sorts," it kind of captures the crankiness of printers when they run out of a particular letter. And we know that, we know in the early modern period that even people like Shakespeare had their texts changed. When they would send them to the printer, they'd have certain wording, and the wording would be changed because they ran out of certain letters, and they would decide to use a synonym for the word, or they had different spellings and things like that. So the compositor, probably the most famous compositor in history would be Ben Franklin, but the compositor is the printer person who lines, reads a text and lines all of the different punches into a compositor's stick, or what's called a sort here, and kind of line them up. Some compositors got tired of having to use the same phrases over and over again, so they cast all the letters into one phrase that they would use all over and over again, and they called that a cliché. So today when you hear what a cliché is, that is a word that's used so much that even the printers are tired of having to kind of cast it letter by letter, and so they would do it that way. So there's a whole kind of colorful vocabulary, things like uppercase, lowercase letters. Those aren't the terms that writers used to use. They would use minuscules and majuscules, but they were literally carried in different cases. If we go back to this image here, you'll see in the background here, there's usually an upper drawer and a lower drawer in which the letters are held. So while most people themselves wouldn't have handled print, and they might not have even seen a print shop, a lot of the terms, a lot of the way that it was actually done in the early modern period kind of entered our lexicon and kind of shaped the way we have print. But what's most striking, probably, if you look at Gutenberg's actual typeface, and this is one of 3 that he designed in the 1540s when he was designing print, especially when you see it in full text, I think it's kind of visually attractive, but it's also not easy for us to read. Like when you see a full page of this, it's not easy to read at all. We often call this black letter, based on the type of medieval script that he was trying to imitate. It also is called sometimes Fraktur, from the German word to fracture, to break up, because the kind of handwriting requires you to stop and make all of these angular motions, and you're constantly breaking as a writer. But what's most important is that Gutenberg, in designing print, wanted it to look as much as possible like actual writing. So here is just those letters kind of organized in actual text here. So again, for us, it maybe takes a fair amount of pausing and optical recognition to figure out what the letters are. But in his day, people seemed to read it quite smoothly and quickly. And which brings me to one of the interesting points about type, which is legibility, how legible it is. Really depends on how familiar you are with those conventions or systems. So a type that's highly legible in one period might not be in another. And we have interesting examples like Times Roman when it was designed for the Times newspaper. A lot of people didn't like it, but it became used throughout the newspaper. It's in everything from Dr. Seuss to Wikipedia uses Times Roman. But over the years, especially in children's books and in newspapers, it became such an established set of conventions that nowadays it's kind of, when scientists study this, it's one of the most legible fonts. But again, when it was first introduced, and we'll see this kind of throughout the talk today, there's often this tension between people wanting to use what's familiar and then innovators coming in and saying, can we design something better? But anyway, so this is his kind of black letter. And just to show you how much it kind of mimics, this is a hand-written script Bible from just a couple decades before Gutenberg's. And there you see an excerpt from Gutenberg's Bible on the right. So you see how much it really mirrors the handwriting of the time that Gutenberg was familiar with and his audience was familiar with. These are people who spent years understanding how to make these letters. And I'm going to show you an actual video. I thought it'd be interesting to see the the motions of calligraphy, how people wrote at the time. So this is someone writing black letter script. So you can see the kind of angular motions. And a lot of design schools, when they teach print and typography and graphic designs, they actually start with calligraphy, like Steve Jobs did. They bring in brushes and pens and have students make letters of the alphabet, so they literally feel the kinetic motion of what it's like to make these letter writing scripts. And each time period had different scripts or hands. So Gutenberg was familiar with the late medieval Black Tor, but there's others. There's Carolingian, Varangian, Benevetian scripts, each with different types of motions. But interestingly enough, this shapes letters for many years. One of the things that's kind of fascinating is that all of our letters, if you look carefully like at an O, until about 100 years ago, it almost always had an oblique slant. All of the curves and bowls are slanted in a certain way to mimic this type of pen ray here. And the same with everything else. Why does a G have this weird ear? Why do a lot of our letters, almost like animals in evolution, have these little bits that are left over from centuries, millennia before. But there's these kind of remainders of the motions here. in the print itself. So here's another image, just so you can see of Gutenberg's Bible. This was his kind of lifelong passion, was to create, you know, a beautifully scripted Bible that could be kind of mass-produced by the standards of the age. And it is, you know, quite an impressive document. And it's nice to always see print with, I'm going to focus on the letters itself, but spacing matters, margins matter, especially at different time periods. The color of the page, the quality of the paper, these things matter a lot. But you can get an idea of Gutenberg's style. And he himself used to always call it mechanical writing, which I always find a very interesting phrase, which is, so he wouldn't say like, I'm involved in print, he'd say, I'm involved in mechanical writing. But again, I think it captures the sense in which he wanted print to very much mimic the art of calligraphy, of handwriting of the day. And just so you can see, there are other typesetters in this time period. If you go online or look for fonts, usually the name Fraktur is what to keep in mind. That's kind of the generic name that captures this whole set. But I just put these up just so you can see too that there are different type designers that are using different styles of letters. In fact, this one here, you'll notice, doesn't even have the lower bold. And as having a 5-year-old daughter who's trying to figure out letters, this is something I find very interesting, is that she'll be like, well, why does this G have a bold? Why doesn't it have a normal open tail? We, as adults, are, because you've read many different texts and you've experienced many different signage, you're able to recognize a pattern of what an A is, even when it breaks the rules of one particular. In fact, I forgot to put a slide. I have a slide of the letter A done in 40 different types. And it's almost impossible. People who try to design computers to do optical reading, it's really hard to design a program that can find that pattern. Because again, almost every script will break whatever pattern or rule you want to make. Like we have a professor in the computer science department, Jared Weinman, who is working on text recognition for maps. So he wants computers to be able to read old maps and to be able to record the place names. It'd be great for genealogists or people studying geography or history. But it's really hard because every map maker uses different fonts. And again, and I won't talk about it as much, but your brain is a really powerful and interesting processor that's always trying to detect patterns, and that's easily thrown off too as well. It both has amazing abilities to discern a letter, but I'll talk a little bit later about how there's optical illusions and there's ways in which your brain gets frustrated if type doesn't do certain things. But so anyway, so we have a kind of a family of these kinds of letters here that are popular in the first, say, 50 years of print, and especially in Europe and Northern Europe. And then we have the Renaissance come along, and one of the big figures of the Italian Renaissance especially is Petrarch. And he really did not like that Fraktur kind of style of writing. In fact, he's the one who kind of terms it Gothic, and by Gothic he means that's shorthand for barbarian script. So even today sometimes that will also be described as Gothic script. But he thought it was ugly, he thought it was especially very hard to read, way too laborious and all of these breaks and extra scripts. And so he wanted to return, and this was a big theme throughout the Renaissance, return to the simplicity and wisdom of the ancients, of the classics, of people in Greece and Rome. And so he went, like a lot of humanists that were studying ancient texts through multiple translations, trying to recover what had been lost in their mind during the Dark Ages of the medieval period. And so they came upon what they saw as this kind of beautiful script, and they called it the ancient letter. They thought this is how Romans wrote. We know that Romans did not write this way. What they discovered were early medieval manuscripts from the 6th, 7th, and 8th century that had this beautiful kind of less encumbered handwriting here. The Romans themselves did not have any lowercase letters. They wrote all in capital letters. But they thought that this was the script that Cicero and others wrote in. So they kind of revived it, and Petrarch himself wrote several books on handwriting and had several disciples that kind of taught this new, clean script. It was one of the first signs that you were a humanist, a man of letters, was how you wrote. And that's one of the things that's interesting about handwriting throughout history, is it tells a lot about your education, your professional status. People were taught in particular kinds of scripts. So the humanists had their own kind of writing style. Here's another example. And one last one that kind of verges on the creation in the late 15th century of italics, writing very quickly and very fluidly. And all of those, again, all of those motions where you're doing these kinds of oblique kind of rotations in that kind of Gothic script, people want something that's very quick, that can be done where the letters connect to one another very fluidly when they're writing. And they're doing a lot more writing in the Renaissance than in earlier time periods. It's not just a handful of legal scribes and scribes to royal courts. This is merchants, this is men of letters trying to write, so they developed this quick script. And here's just a couple examples of the print versions to capture that. So humanist printers, especially in Venice in the late 1500s, decide we want type, not like Gutenberg, we want type like this. It's open, airy, easy to read. It kind of mimics the kind of humanist handwriting. And these come from a geometric text that was from the Arab world that was being translated into it here. And as I was saying earlier, that was one other thing that's kind of interesting in the history of type is italics that were designed partially to mimic this new handwriting, but partially to fit more words on the page. Italics, and in fact, a lot of the slant that came into handwriting came into imitating italic writing rather than vice versa. And so a Venetian printer, especially Aldus Manutius, invented italics because he could fit you could fit 1/3 more text on a page with italics. And if any of you have done that on a Word document, that is the way to get around space problems, right? You either have two options. You can shrink the font or you can shift it to italics, and it's a huge difference in there. But one of the things that's kind of important to know is that italics are not just slanted letters. Each letter is redesigned to be different. You can see that if you look carefully at a text in italics. The actual shape, the curve of the letter, everything about it is different than it is in regular. So it was designed originally to be an economical, easy to read, kind of innovative style of text. And there's a lot of funny reactions of people at the time as they tried to deal with this new. Imagine if someone invented, just as a thought experiment, imagine if someone invented text that was shifted to the left. What would it like to be to read a book where everything was shifted to the left or everything was turned sideways or something? I mean, a lot of these innovations that today are kind of standard, our eyes are used to them, at the time were seen as quite startling. So while the Renaissance is busy, kind of fulfilling their wish of returning to a golden age of the classics, in little letters, they're also doing the same with capital letters. And this is where we get an important part of type, which is serifs, the little kind of lines and brackets that come off of letters. We'll see them kind of throughout. But they go back to things like Trajan's column in Rome, other places, and they start studying these capital letters, what they call quadrats. And they literally go with graph paper, and they kind of map them and try to figure out, why do these letters look so beautiful? What did the Romans know about carving and engraving and designing letters that we don't know? And so they ended up, again, like first in handwriting, this one is an actual written text here, but they end up studying and carefully, kind of trying to capture these ideas of symmetry, of balance, of proportion. This is the same time period when they're doing the same thing with architecture. They're rediscovering Roman architecture and rules about proportions and the different orders and things like that. So the same thing is happening in letters itself, and it gives us what are recognizable modern letters. And I don't want to flip back, but compare these letters to like Gutenberg's capitals, with all of their ornate cross-hatching and kind of Gothic form. They're quite different letters here. Now, there's also some really fun and interesting aspects of Renaissance design of type. I was mentioning that often type kind of reflects the ideas and values and aspirations of a period. And that's especially true with Renaissance text. So I'm going to focus just for a second on this figure, Geoffroy Toury, who was a French humanist who studied in Venice, was very influential, became the official engraver and printer to the King of France. And he developed a book on how to create these letters. But Da Vinci did the same, Albrecht Dürer. There's a lot of famous names of the Renaissance and humanism that focused, but I find him the most interesting. Mainly because, we have all of this intense geometry. These humanists, especially, they're often kind of artist engineers. They're people like Da Vinci. They're building fortifications, they're building cathedrals, they're making maps, they're doing engravings, they're making clocks. They're kind of multi-skilled, and they're skilled especially in the use of mathematical instruments and new rules of perspective and optics and things like that. So you see this in the creation of all these letters. Some of his letters require you to take like 9 compass point readings to create the different curves that are in each of these letters. Here's an image of the book so you can kind of see some of them. Again, based on Roman letters, but also trying to understand what they think are the secret principles of Roman letter making and architecture. What did they unlock about the fundamental rules of aesthetics these Renaissance people wanted to learn. So again, about proportion and ratios. Like, is there a relationship between the ratio of the tail of the R to its bowl? Turns out it's like 4 to 1 ratio, and like, oh, that must be magical. That must be one of the tricks. And so they're doing all this studying, and they're doing it with everything. I forgot to bring, I have images of Da Vinci studying the leg of a horse, and he's breaking up each muscle into measurements and trying to figure out, is the quadricep 4 times as big as the calf muscle, and if so, does that reflect the divine proportion of the universe, just like the letter R? And they're doing this with a lot of things, and you see it especially, one of the ideas of the Renaissance that's really important is their sense of, and they use the Greek word cosmos for order, but their sense of order is that everything is interconnected, and that what makes beauty and harmony in the celestial sphere, the movement of the planets, is the same thing that makes beauty and harmony in architecture, in the human face, in the letter Q. Right? And in fact, they're all interrelated. And Vesuvius Man, this kind of famous image of Da Vinci, reflects the fact that man sits at the intersection. He represents, circles represent the divine. Everything that moves in the heavens moves in circular patterns in the Renaissance, whereas everything that moves on earth moves in straight lines. So man sits at the intersection between the cosmos and the microcosm. So anyway, there's a lot of symbolism, I guess is the point. And more importantly, Renaissance people, again, believe that these letters are connected to the movement of planets, like as in zodiac ideas of astrology, connected to the different parts of human anatomy. So some letters are pleasing to the spleen as opposed to the foot. So they have these kind of what to us are Baroque ideas, and you see them in in Torrey's text, where he uses the kind of Vesuvius Man to talk about how each letter is connected to the human physique and body, and again, connected to cosmos ideas in ways that are strange to us, but also really fascinating. This is why I love doing history, because people are strange, fascinating, and have all kinds of different beliefs. So here's one, for instance, where he talks about, here are the 7 or 8 liberal arts: music, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry. And he's trying to see how those arts, which also line up with the number of planets in the heavens and the solar system, how they're related to the ratios of letters here. Are there different parts of letters that reflect music? Is the curve of an R reflective of music, and the stern line of an L reflects geometry or stuff? So all kinds of interesting study and ideals kind of tied up, including this notion, the Renaissance is very popular, about how human faces reflect different kind of types in humanity, and also reflect these different sets of disciplines and different, again, drawing on astronomy, different orders of the cosmos. So we see him just in this text and in other people at the time, just playing with all of these ideas. So I find it very interesting. I'd also point out that a lot of what happens during this late Renaissance time period is the development of texts that are highly successful and are still used today. So I imagine a lot of you would have an easier time reading this. Maybe it's not as easy as the Fraktur that we saw from Gutenberg, but it's usually a lot easier. There's still some old things left over, like these ligatures, this is an S rather than an F. There's certain letters that will throw people off, but in general, it looks like today's books. And if you pick up a trade press book, it's very likely to have print that was designed during this period. So some of the famous, so this is Nicholas Jensen's Roman type. This is used by Harper and Collins. It's used by Basic Books. It's used by Penguin. It's a very popular. It's been slightly changed, but my favorite text, I'll put my typeface love on the line here, but my favorite one is Garamond, who was Torrey's successor and student. And Garamond designed a typeface that's widely available on Microsoft Word. Maybe you use it. It's a really, to me, elegant, open, airy design. I saw a study once that said if the government switched to Garamond, it would save like $460 million a year in printing costs, because it uses far less ink. It's a very light, kind of sharp, but easy to read kind of design. And I think it's really interesting that people 400 years ago designed type that we still use today. And so, like I said, a lot of the trade presses use Bempo, which is a type, Garamond, Gaudi, Bookman, Palatino. There's about 8 or 9 of these types that were designed in the late 1400s, early 1500s that are still used today. Haven't been improved on a whole lot, to some people's mind. So here's a close-up of Garamond's text. And again, and I'll talk about this in a second, but part of it is the type maker has to create beautiful letters, but they also have to create what is often called color on a page. Like you want to be able to see a certain amount of white to make the letter appear off the page, but if it's too thin, if it's not enough color, then it's seen as hard to read. So a lot of this is based on kind of both Renaissance study of geometry and optics, but a lot of trial and error and create scripts. And these are the kinds of things that when I would go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford and would read this on a clean, because often the paper is beautiful. It was done before wood pulp and acid, so these were rag papers that are as beautiful today as they were 400 years ago. Pristine, white, soft, you know, they're amazing text to read on. So see these kind of, again, they're engraved, so they're pushed into the text, so they have a kind of sharper line often. So it's amazing to read them, especially as someone who read them in microfilm originally. Like, the difference is unbelievable. So we have Garamond, and here are some other examples I was mentioning. You have things like Bempo, Caslon, I'll talk about in a little bit, as an English type from this period. At the end of it, it's famous, used all throughout the English world. So in terms of typography, like classification, which I don't want to get too much into, but there are probably like 4 or 5 categories that are worth knowing. So we have humanist type from the very early periods I was talking about, and really tries to mimic handwriting, has very oblique stress, mirrors, script writing, those things I was talking about. Then you have this what are called old style Roman fonts, so designed before about 1750. And then I'll talk a little bit later about modern serif fonts. But you'll notice that, getting back to this point of serifs, how the letters all have, they usually have little feet to them, little marker lines here. These are kind of added, again, because they admired them in the Roman thing, and they do important things for your eyes in terms of moving them along the page and making letters discernible. I'll talk about in a second. So Caslon especially is popular and famous for being used for the Declaration of Independence, but it was widely used in English printing, like in the 18th and early 19th century. It's kind of seen as one of the most elegant, simple, easy to read texts. Printers used to have a phrase that they'd often say, when in doubt, print in Caslon. It kind of embodied one of the ideals of printers. It's not always the ideal, but one ideal is that good print is invisible. Really good print, you don't notice it because it doesn't have any problems, it doesn't have any flaws, it's not flashy. It just conveys information with elegance and economy and clarity. And so Caslon kind of represented that ideal. So we have about 150 years of people honing. And I'll talk a little bit later, but they really are honing these typefaces to figure them out. In fact, let me just pause for 1 second to, sorry, it's going to be visually hard on people's eyes, lots of white here, but I wanted to pull up a sheet of, this is Caslon's specimen of type that he used, and I find it hard in PowerPoint to navigate it. But one of the things I want to talk about just for a second is the difference between type and fonts. And I'm not trying to like be, no one has to memorize definitions here, but this is kind of actually important and interesting. So a typeface is a family of types, like Caslon here, right? When someone says a font in popular usage, they mean that often. But among printers, a font is a typeface at a particular weight. So is it bold? Is it semi-bold? Is it book? Is it light? Is it extra light? Medium light? Often fonts will be sold at the commercial level and up to something like 25 different weights here. It also means whether things like, is it small cap? Is it brevi cap? Is it full cap? Is it ornate full cap? And you know, every point too, is it 12 point, 14 point, 16 point? So it's the weight, it's the size, and it's the design. So Caslon has this sheet which looks probably like something you'd fear at an optometrist's office. But so we have, like for instance, small pica Roman number 1, small pica Roman number 2, the same text done in. Printers would look at this very careful, and this is why I wanted to mention this distinction, because each font is redesigned from its parent font. Because as you either scale up or scale down, make a font thinner or thicker, you have to redesign it because it doesn't work. So it's not just the mechanical, I take a 14-point font and I shrink it to 12 point. you have to redesign the bowl of the P, because when it gets smaller, it starts to look full. Or you have to redesign how the I relates to the M. So every level of these fonts, every one with a different weight, size, and stuff is fundamentally redesigned. Not every single letter, but often up to like half of the letters have to be reworked in order to make them work quite well. So there's a lot of really intricate skill that's involved in that. And that's what I want to talk about now for a sec. All right, so here's another example just to show you kind of from today. Again, I like Garamond, but to show you, Garamond Pro Regular, Pro Italic, these different things. Often the reason why people really enjoy book fonts is that they're designed at a specific weight for books that aren't available on home processors or computers. So they often have what's called book weight. So it's a weight designed especially to be read in an Octavio Quarto format. So it's just really pleasing to your eyes, and it's been designed by a team of people often over years trying these things. So part of it's abstract. They sit and they look at each letter and they think about what they want to achieve. Part of it is just putting phrases together and be like, ooh, that's not good. That Y and that X run together totally there. Or why is there a big gap between the A and the B? Or why does the B and the P look similar to each other? Do I need to extend the heights of the ascenders and things like that? So there's a lot of challenges, and one of the things that makes it hard is that they're trying to do two incompatible things. They're trying to make every single letter legible so that you can read, and all of us, no matter, even if you think you're a slow reader, think about how fast your mind is processing all of these little letters and putting them together as a word. So you want to make text incredibly distinctive and legible, each letter, but you also want them to look like each other. You want someone to buy your font as opposed to someone else's because there's a spirit to it. It shares visual unity. And one way to think about that is to look at kind of an exercise, right? On the top, we have letters where none of you will have a problem picking out each individual letter, right? But they're not readable in any fundamental way. They don't go together. And I know that this is a very kind of intense version of this kind of principle. But it's one that happens a lot, where people will design, again, when they do an alphabet, they'll design a whole set of letters that they think look beautiful. And then when they put them together, they find that the letters run together, they detract from each other. Or there are these, the typographers have these checklists of different letters that create real problems for them all the time. So they have to kind of redo that. There's also this issue of rhythm. Yeah, printers have their own speed. I was mentioning earlier about color. There's this issue of rhythm. Yeah, this is horrible. Right? A lot of you probably haven't seen really bad text because usually it's done pretty well, like over centuries. But often when text or typefaces are first designed, they'll have real problems with this. And in fact, often typefaces, when they were done in metal, would be designed with multiple types of a particular letter, each one that has less space between it, if that makes sense. So A is a problem. A runs into a lot of letters. So they'll have an A that has a 1-point space or a 2-point space, depending on whether you're putting the A next to an M or whatnot. So they'll often, and again, terminology, if you ever hear the word glyphs, that's what printers mean. So you have a character of the alphabet, like A, B, or C. And then you have a glyph, which is an actual type which represents that. And so that could be, and like I said, if you look at your case, you might have like 10 glyphs for the letter A, because you might have ones that have different spacing. Or maybe you have one where the A has a bowl in it, or versus the A that is just one loop, if you know what I'm saying. Those are two glyphs to represent the letter A. So anyway, so we had this issue about rhythm here. And we have another one in which the rhythm is not between the words, but the rhythm is between the sizes of the bowls and the sizes of the widths of the bowls, things like that, right? So this is what, when we talk about rhythm, we also talk about kind of color. Text are supposed to, your eyes get very easily distracted if there's too much white or too much black. You will look at a page and it will just start to kind of almost dissolve into random dots and colors if it's not done rightly. And so they do what's called kerning often with this, which is they take a type, and here's an example just to show you kind of visually. They've moved, if it was set evenly between all the letters, it would look like the red. But, sorry, it would look like the blue. but they've moved the letters in design so to make them closer here. So this is what's called kerning, the process by which you kind of move letters apart or move them closer. You know what I'm saying? So otherwise, these are not evenly spaced. Your mind would not like evenly spaced letters, which seems strange. So they have to kind of trick your mind because it often sees things that it doesn't here. And these are often, interestingly, based on rules developed by writing masters, sometimes in the 14th and 15th century, which is at the heart of every type design, and I'm kind of getting into the weeds, but is what's called X height. How high are the lowercase letters? And that's a fundamental rule or aspect of any font design. And they've discovered that the ratio should be about, the height should be about 5 lengths of the nib of a pen. So that's how writing masters told people to write a certain X height to do that. And different typographers have played with that, but it actually has big consequences. Adjusting this a little bit can make a very big difference in legibility. Here's just a kind of a quote from a modern type designer. But again, sometimes books will be put into press and people will be like, I don't know why, but I don't like this type. It's too light, it's too dark, something like that. And again, they're not talking about the individual darkness of the character. They're all printed with a certain black, right? They're talking about their mind seeing patterns of light and dark and blending them together in ways that are helpful. And I'll end on this note here for our break, but just about the kind of modern day consequences. We're in the midst of a large campaign/controversy right now in the US about whether we want to redesign our road signs. So we currently use what's called Highway Gothic, although I forget its official name is like Highway Series E or something like that. But it's called Gothic because it's kind of a font style. But, so here's Highway Gothic here. This is what we're kind of familiar with. It was developed kind of coming out of the 1940s and 50s. The Air Force had hired type designers to design lettering for runway, other things for long distance viewing. And so when the interstate system came around, they said, let's use this lettering. But new type designers complain that it's too closed inward. Its X height and its width violate those rules I was talking about, the 1:5 ratio. So this one is what's being proposed as an alternative, clear view. I don't know if you find it clearer or not. They do studies, they say that, that this particular kind of viewing, let me see here, nighttime sign reading increased by distance by 16% among people, which means that you would have an extra 80 feet of reading distance if you were traveling at 45 miles per hour. And they found this especially true by age. People over the age of 50 found this signage much clearer to read. And so there is a lot of, I just want to say there's a lot of interesting science that's been going on in the 20th century to figure out. Sometimes it confirms what people learned in the Renaissance. Sometimes it suggests something radically different. The problem is, as you can imagine how much it costs to change all the signage. They've done it partially through the National Park Service. They've tried it out with the National Park Service, but I think they're going to actually switch to this for this reason here. But, so, last thing, and I promise we'll stop, but there is another thing that I always loved, which is a problem what they call dazzle or sway. A lot of the English language has these upstrokes, and I don't have a particularly good image. It's hard to kind of convey on electronics, but if you look at the top, I don't know, sometimes you can see it starts to dance or dazzle. Or like when you look at a lot of straight lines, your mind is trying to pick out a pattern. This is true again with a lot of the visual cognition science to kind of emphasize that our mind plays tricks on us. And so a lot of the fonts have this problem where they'll run it, they'll think they have a beautiful font, and then they'll put it on the page, and people say that it just kind of dances on the page. And so you see this a lot, especially in the 18th and 19th century. So the mind plays a lot of tricks that typographers have to kind of overcome. So we'll stop there, and then have a break, and then come back.
Thank you for taking your seats, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who have. It's hard to get away from the cookies and coffee and each other's visiting, isn't it? Right now we're ready for the second half of Mike's class on what is your type, Mike Guenther.
Thank you. And I meant to say earlier, anyone has a question or a comment or anything, feel free to raise your hand anytime during the talk. So, did anyone have a question that they didn't? Yeah.
I do, Mike. When you were showing the Gutenberg text,
Mm-hmm.
and do you know how technically they were able to print the black and the red? I mean, for example, there would be a red word sprinkled through the text. Now, that must be very difficult, given the technology of the time, to pull that off.
Right. I was mentioning, we were talking to someone else earlier about that. Sometimes those were actually printed in red. There were some of them, illuminators would come in later and color them in. There were some typefaces that were designed with just an outside edge, but the inside could be done, especially at higher display fonts, were designed so that you could draw lines, whatever, and stuff like that. But no, red printing was expensive. I mean, when I look at 18th century sources, they charged 3 times as much the printing cost if you included red letters. And to do only one is hard. My understanding is that it was left blank on the first print run, and then a second print run was come through with just that color. At least, and I assume Gutenberg did like that. I know that other printers, like in Venice and stuff, that's what they did later on. That's why they charge a lot, because you have to take every page through, back through. And it was often reserved just for title pages, which could be done once or whatever. But no, that is a good question. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff to be, if anyone is interested to look at these and to learn about them, there's a lot of really good books on like the history of the mechanics of printing, how they inked the actual runs and things like that. But I want to put in a plug quickly just for Grinnell College. We have a wonderful special collection down in the basement library that's open to everyone in town. We have an amazing collection of several hundred pre-1600 books. So we have, and the archivist, Chris Jones, not surprisingly, loves books, loves type, loves showing them to people. So go down there. They're open, I think, from 1 to 4:30 in the afternoon. Go down there and say, like, I want to see what Fraktur text from the 1500s looks like. They'll bring out the huge thing, and again, you have the experience of what it's like to look on the paper. And we also have in the Z's a large, I don't know who was responsible for buying them, but we have a large typographical collection of oversized, beautiful illustrated books on type. We must have like 60 or 80 books on the history. And again, I don't know which faculty member or librarian made sure we have that, but for a school our size, we have a beautiful collection in the library that you can look at. Yeah.
Well, I noticed in the Gutenberg Bible that the text was what I would call justified, that each line went from left to right all the way. And I would think for the one putting in the typeset that would require spatial intelligence. And mechanically, how was that accomplished? To have the spacing so perfect.
Yeah, so the question was about, and I had forgotten to repeat the question earlier, for those watching later or now. But so how did they do the justifying of margins and the clean? And this was something that Gutenberg spent a lot of time on. He wanted his Bible to look beautifully crisp and clean. It was something that scribes also thought a lot about. And they often would individually, you'll see letters getting a little more narrow as they come to the end. But it's harder to do that with print for that reason, because it is this kind of mechanical. So one thing I want to point out is I think you're absolutely right. Like, it takes a certain level of visual intelligence and spatial thinking that we see with a lot of great printers and print designers, that they're able to do that. Later periods, they started using a lot of hyphenation between lines, which was a technique developed, which when it first came out, people did not like it. So you have a word just break halfway and do that. But a lot has to come down to the spacing between the words. So, and again, this is where it gets into that kind of the art of it, more than even the science, is figuring out how many more spaces can you squeeze between a word to get it so that it lines up beautifully. And then part of it comes down to what I was saying a little bit earlier, whereas people would change text sometimes. Like, where they would just say, like, I know a better word that only uses 4 letters. And we'll have a beautiful break. So there's a scholar, Adrian Johns in particular at Chicago, who studied how, some of it was like scientists angry with having their text changed, or other writers. But we do know that compositors sometimes, for visual reasons, would play a little bit loose and fast. But yes, it is a challenge. And I think that's why when you see, I'm probably not doing type justice in some ways by focusing so much on just these individual letters, because it is a collective performance that involves paper, spacing, margins. But again, if you get a chance, either at Grinnell or whenever you're at a museum or something that has some of these older or beautiful books. They don't have to be old books. There's books printed 10 years ago that are that beautiful typeface. The University of Iowa has a huge center for the book that's kind of internationally renowned, and they have a display case. So yeah, definitely encourage it. Yeah.
when did the use of italics for emphasis come rather than a particular typeface?
So when did the use of italics come in for emphasis? Again, italics have an interesting history. They first started out, my sense is in the 17th century that they come in for use for emphasis. They're first used to cram words on pages, as I mentioned. They then have a second life in classical texts, often pairing, if any of you grew up reading the Loeb classics, of Greek and Latin that are in green and red, but there's this tradition of kind of putting a classical language text next to whether it's English or French, depending on what country you're in. So they were used for languages also, and especially for place names. There's a tradition in the early period that they would put St. Petersburg or London in italics. But it was kind of a mess. There were people trying to sort out the convention. What should italics stand for? Right? There was an attempt to use italics for quotations instead of quotation marks, so people would just put everything in a text in italics that someone would say. So there's a lot of experimentation. I don't think it really ends, and I'm not an expert. My sense is by the 19th century, things have been settled down into the kind of current emphasis, the current use of it to emphasize certain words. But I know in the 18th century, there's still a lot of experimentation. Yeah.
What can you say about how this history of printing is in Arabic, Chinese, other languages that don't use the Roman alphabet? Even Greece, yeah.
So what can I say about the use of print, or the development and evolution of print in other languages besides English? And there was a question also during the break about how many languages are based on a kind of Latin alphabet versus others. So I will say that when I showed you the Caslon sheet, some people noticed on there's Arabic, Hebrew, Cyrillic, things like that. So especially because a lot of these early printing texts were done at universities that had theology departments where people were reading in a lot of languages. People would be surprised at how early in the English-speaking world or Western Europe they developed multiple typefaces to deal with Arabic, all of these kinds of things. But I guess the short answer, I don't know. I would love to learn more. I don't know a lot about the history of printing like in the Ottoman Empire or in the East. I know some examples, and they've even come around lately, where people argue that the visual cues by which all of us recognize letters are very specific to Western Europe, and that people coming from other cultures might have hard times figuring out our visual cues. So there's been an attempt to design alphabets that include flourishes, swashes, distinctive marks from Arabic, or especially from like Chinese and Japanese, stuff like that. So there are young designers out on the web that design fonts meant to be for English-speaking audience, but for people from Asia, where they can kind of recognize those things. But we had an exhibit actually at the college about Chinese printing. That was really interesting, including posters, but going back to the 15th century. But I don't know too much about it. I don't know how much Western European ideals and practices migrated, or whether they developed their own indigenous traditions or when. But it would be a great thing to say. I need to find someone at the college to come back and talk about that. Is that great? Okay. Yeah.
Maintaining columns. This, and you may not wish to speak to this, which is fine, but the linotype machine was a system of setting up type where spacing could be adjusted and columns were kept absolutely straight. And linotype operators were very skilled people using text. Are you going to touch on that at all, or is it, and it's fine to stay away from it?
No, yeah. I'm not staying away from purpose, but no, you're absolutely right. I'm not going to talk as much about the history of the different means of printing, but linotype is a huge innovation. And I'm not going to talk about engraving and a lot of different things about book arts I won't. And I don't know as much about linotype. What I know is what you're saying, which is that it took real skill to run the machines, but that it was an enormous breakthrough and revolutionized text. And in fact, often when you buy typefaces and fonts today online, they'll usually be described as like Garamond linotype or whatever, because it's often seen as one of the golden ages of print. The particular forms used are seen as so beautiful that often, or Caslon linotype or something like that. But I don't know, I should talk to you later, I don't know as much about the mechanics of how a linotype machine works or something like that. I don't know, but that is a good point. So, let me just go back just for a second. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but just to finish out a couple more things about this, what I call like the visual logic of variation. I was talking about how your mind sees things differently. And so when you blow up a font, some interesting things emerge about, like I said, how they have to tweak them. So one thing is that certain rounded fonts always go above the X height, whereas other ones do not. I don't have a good example here, but it turns out that if it's a curve and it meets that height, it looks shorter. So they have to artificially inflate it and make it go above, because again, your mind doesn't see it. I don't think I have an example here, but eyes, the dot on an eye are almost always moved to the right on a thing, because the way the eye slopes are, if it was put directly over the center, you would think it were kind of falling over. It was too large to the left. T's are usually thickened at the base in an artificial way, because people said that they look like they were going to fall over. They're seen as these things. You do not see them on poster size. And again, when I said that every font is designed differently, display font, so font above, say, 40 points, very big font, or something you'd see on a sign. There, your mind would detect these differences and they distract you. So display fonts have almost no optical variation built into them. They are rigidly uniform. But at the smaller level, your mind would see confusion, it would see variation, if they were uniform. So they have to kind of design these different things. And you'll see like the E here, it lifts up on the line, it's not perfectly flat. Because again, it would actually look distorted if it were flat. So there's a lot of intentional detail gone into each of these letters to figure them. And again, they play with them. They'll think, well, how long of a sender do I need? What kind of serif should I have? Should I have a straight serif, a wedge serif, a curved serif? You know, so there's a lot of those kinds of items. And the last thing I just kind of point out too is that italics are not uniformly slanted, because again, it's not pleasing to the eye. So you can see here from Caslon's how, hopefully you can see the audience, but they're all slanted at different angles. They look a little higgledy-piggledy. But they look nice together as a group when they work this way, whereas if they were done all straight, it's seen as not as pleasant. Let's see what this is. Okay, that was just an interesting. So the design process has a lot of this fun, you know, here's the note sheets for Mercury type where teams of designers look over and kind of decide, well, you need that W to kind of bend in a little bit, and you need these things. So that, and again, it also put them in different word orders and on pages to see how they work. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, especially in book type of type, so we're talking about 12 to 10-point font, there's this issue of bleeding. So when it's printed on the page, the ink doesn't stay perfectly within the borders usually of the actual, although linotype might have been a little bit different, I can't remember. And it matters the quality of the paper too, but so bleeding is not a big deal on big letters, but on small letters, and especially if there's a lot of difference, like on the thinnest stroke, it might increase, you see that this is the gray shading is the bleeding, it's probably doubled the width of the stroke there. And so that's a big problem sometimes, the bleeding. So again, these have to be redesigned at lower fonts, lower type sizes to be different, because they're going to be bleeding, and so it just fundamentally distorts the shape. So I study the Enlightenment, it's my favorite time period. It is a good age for type, a lot of famous type setters from Ben Franklin to others. One of the things I find interesting is, like the Renaissance, their types designers are interested in using science and optics, but we don't see any of the things I showed you earlier about microcosm and macrocosm and human symmetry. Instead, it's much more about kind of a scientific approach, rationalism, and trying to figure out, using optics and experimentation. This is the era when they first start to sit people down and have them read a page and count how often their eyes blink as a sign of visual stress to see. And so they're interested in doing different kinds of experiments, and especially this kind of hyper-geometric, you know, they want, this is a little bit against what I was saying earlier, the kind of careful adjustment and variation. This is the age of kind of classical rigor and uniformity, and especially the idea of universality. So they want every curve to represent a particular circle ratio, and they want them to all be interlocking and whatnot. So they have a lot of these, you know, kind of geometric features. There is, though, also a lot of interesting curving going on that wasn't in earlier print type. It tends to have much more fluid curves, which kind of reflect some of the handwriting that's popular in the 18th century. Although, let's see, I'll come back to this in a second. There's a question about the difference I was saying between old and modern types. The old types are all slanted. Modern type is kind of, which comes around the Age of Enlightenment, is very straight up forward. They're like, why do we want to tilt the bowl of an O just because a writing master in the 12th century did that? We want our print to stand straight and geometrically true, and so that a lot of the things like that. So I thought, maybe the best person to kind of exemplify the Enlightenment world of type is John Baskerville, whose typesetting kind of created quite a stir. He's interesting because he was trained as a drawing master, a writing master, an artist. He did a lot of like japanning of wood and lacquering of woods, and trained a lot of different arts. But I think he really kind of combined both that geometric consistency, but also he's famous for his flourishes, or like his Q has this swishy tail that was once described like a frisky squirrel. If any of you watch Masterpiece Theater on PBS, Masterpiece tried to capture that with its R. In Master, the R has this kind of flowing thing. A lot of people have tried to imitate his style, but he combined, like I said, that kind of geometric consistency with an intention to flourish. And especially what he did different was he varied the strokes incredibly between thick and thin, which is something that people hadn't really done before. And it captured the style of writing that had become popular in the second half of the 18th century, the kind of English roundhand, or sometimes it's called today copperplate, because they were done on these copperplate engravings to show how they're done. Let me show you what it looks like, and I think you'll see the kind of aesthetic ideals that he was tapping into. So at the heart of roundhand is a very fluid motion, but especially you'll notice the difference between the upward strokes and the downward strokes. The nib has this ability to spread and create, and this is a pretty modest, I mean, there are some nibs that can create, huge widths. You'll probably recognize this handwriting. This is popular for like kind of wedding, any kind of formal invitations. It is the hand that the Declaration of Independence is written in, for the hand copy.
It's so artistic.
And I think that, this is why sometimes when studying type, it's important to remember that these are people who are writing, and that their sense of what words should look like, and about grace and about beauty often come out of this world as well. So yeah, this is the kind of world that Baskerville comes out of, and his font. Okay, well, wait, should we keep going? Okay. Oh no, sorry. I think that was the clip. I can send people more examples. And again, if I were actually well trained in calligraphy, I think this would be a really fun class to do it. Give everyone paper and pen. Yeah, exactly. We should try that sometime. So, but Baskerville, unlike previous ones, has very, very more noticeable. It's not a thinner font. It's thinner in its kind of hairline lines, but then it has thicker. So the contrast is much more intense, and it made quite a splash. People kind of either loved it or hated it. Ben Franklin remembered that he printed something in Baskerville in the 1750s, and one person complained to him that he was going to go blind because the page was so white. Like it just kind of leaped off the page. And other people also felt that. They felt that it was just too intense. And part of it is he also pioneered waxed paper, so paper that, like, kind of like today's, you probably had a page, like a textbook that feels kind of waxy and is like shiningly brilliant white. Right? He used that with his font to create this dazzling kind of image that kind of inspired the modern version. It became very popular. The Church of England printed its Book of Common Prayer. It was used widely, Baskerville fonts, all throughout the 1770s onward. This one doesn't probably blind you. But again, compared to previous fonts, there's these just very different, like, look at the width of the S versus the thin hairline. And again, if you were to see it in person on a kind of brilliant white page, it would stand out even more. And this is what kind of captured font makers for the 19th century. They kept pushing it to extremes. Dito font, which was designed by a Frenchman who bought Baskerville's type, is even more intense in its hairline versus thick, very upright. Notice we've left that world of slanting. This does not look like medieval handwriting, but as I was suggesting, it captures that grace and that difference in English roundhand, of thick versus thin strokes. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, almost every magazine used Dido. Like, it is a very popular font for signs. You probably recognize the Vogue, but if you were to just go through magazines in general, they were almost always Dido, and it's used in a lot of different corporate logos and a lot of print. I mean, it's not as popular for books because it's a little hard to read, especially at lower levels, that contrast and stroke, but it captured the artistry of the kind of early 19th century, late 18th century. And the last person, Bodini, is another person who also did these kinds of intense styles. In fact, among typographers, they just run the two together and they call it Didoni, the two styles. And it's usually seen to exemplify what they call modern Roman fonts. So they all have serifs, but they're straightforward. They have a very high contrast between thick and thin, and they're the kind of fonts that actually are very popular on the web these days as well. Although not originally, because the thin hairlines were very hard to do with pixelation on early computers. I'm not going to get to talk too much. It would be its own lecture, but the exciting world of the 19th century of experiments with sign painting, typography. I just wanted to at least make a reference and to kind of point out that almost every aesthetic movement in the 19th century, whether it's the Art Nouveau movement or arts and crafts, or even in the early 20th century, the Bauhaus movement, almost every movement kind of sought to design its own type to capture its aesthetic principles and its aesthetic kind of spirit. So there's just so much, rich things that you can do with the 19th century type font. But given the kind of time and stuff, I thought I would just kind of jump ahead a little bit to the sans serifs. So these are fonts designed. There are some early ones, in the 17th century. There are some ones that do not have the serifs, but they become especially popular in the 20th century. And one of the ones that really kind of made a splash was Edward Johnston's fonts for the Underground. I have this quote up here. His task, he was ordered by the Underground, commissioned it, and said, like, your font has to be elegant, it should build on principles of all good fonts, but it should belong unmistakably to the 20th century. It was kind of his charge, and so he designed this series here, which was used on London Underground, but was also used by British Railways and a lot of other things, and it captured what was seen as, it captured the modernist aesthetic of the 20th century, freed from the encumbrances of Victorian Baroque, art and architecture. This was clean, it was modern, you could imagine it on a steel or glass building. His student was Eric Gill, who also designed, and even actually more widely used, sans serif font, which is just called Gill Sans. I put this up here. This poster, keep calm and carry on. It's become like, I see it everywhere now. But Gill's posters, his font was used all throughout World War II. It was used in corporate logoing, in all kinds of text. It was a widely popular kind of font. There's a lot of debate in the 20th century about whether these kinds of fonts are more legible than serif fonts. And there's been research, it kind of goes back and forth. It seems to be the consensus among people who study this that these are more legible at larger sizes and for signs, but that they don't have visual comfort as much for long-term reading, which is why you don't see a ton of trade-back books that go sans serif. Some do, but most don't. They were also popular when the websites first came along online because serifs were very hard to do, again, with pixelation that's very small, trying to create delicate curves, and so these just looked better. So they tended to be used a lot on the web, even for full text. But a lot of websites are going back now, deciding not to use that. But anyway, yeah.
I'm just going to say, a lot of people are saying don't teach handwriting now, and script is one of those.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's going to fall out of favor, because kids have trouble reading it now.
Good question. The question is, since a lot of kids aren't being taught how to write handwriting cursive, whether maybe serif will fall out of favor, or do you like this more? Kind of, yeah. It's an issue at our college. My wife, when she teaches her History 100 class, she used to always have the students read handwritten letters from James Norman Hall that are in the special collections. But, most recent class, I think half the students couldn't read it. So it's becoming an issue, and a lot of states have phased out. I think there's that problem. I've also heard the other argument, which is there's so much software now that the number of people under the age of 20 who design their own fonts is enormous. Like people just kind of, they use Adobe Illustrator and can do interesting things. But I kind of agree with you that since we're having I don't know what the answer will be or how it will play out, but I think since we have a growing gulf between the experience of writing and handwriting, and maybe even just teaching some of these aesthetic things in schools, it'll be interesting to see how this rising generation looks at letters. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a big difference. I don't know how to play out, but I agree. I think there will.
When did cursive come in?
When did cursive come in?
Cursive, yeah, when did it start?
So probably you're thinking, I mean, there are scripts starting in the 17th century, merchant hand and stuff, that look cursive in the sense that the letters are connected, they're slanted. You wouldn't recognize it because it's often written with shorthand, like abbreviations, and some of the lettering is different, so it's hard to read. But that starts in the 17th century. What you probably recognize as modern script would be like the Palmer method, like many of you were taught in school. That's kind of late 19th century. Before that, there was a Spencer method that was more like the round hand. So late 19th, early 20th century is the beginning of what we would recognize as kind of modern cursive. But there were other forms of quick writing, but like I said, they just were very different. Yeah.
Some children with learning disabilities find it easier with cursive because they can connect their thoughts when they're printed. You have to keep stopping. It's kids with learning disabilities.
Well, that is a really interesting comment. So you were saying that people with learning disabilities, some find it easier to connect their letters and to write with cursive. And in general, I think there's a whole new wave of research being done by neuroscientists about issues of dyslexia and thinking about how people process the world, sometimes visually, cognitively. So at the heart of dyslexia is often a problem with understanding or forming words. And so I think we're going to see a whole new wave of type design and maybe hopefully conscious thinking about writing that reflects what we're learning about how different, all of us are different in the way we see the world. So maybe I find one type of typeface or font elegant and clear, you might not, or something. And I should point out, we've discovered some interesting things as well, that like, there's different coding in terms of, I don't know if I want to try to cover this, but we process letters based on the top half and the right half of the letter. So if you ever take a line of print and cover the bottom, you usually can read it quite easily. If you do the opposite, it's usually harder. Which is why a lot of the visual cues and serifs, like why does a G have a little ear on the top? It's because your mind is constantly looking at the top right-hand side. People with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, the study research shows, often look bottom left or left. And so they look at different parts of the letters. So I think there's going to be a lot of, I mentioned earlier we might have more multicultural style fonts that use visual cues. We might also have different fonts that are designed differently for people. Well, that doesn't get to your point about the connecting, but there is a lot of cursive fonts. I'm not going to talk about that as much, but you can find online fonts that look like handwriting and are cursive and things like that. But I do think that this is why I think fonts can be quite interesting, because they connect to all these deep questions, like how do we process the world? How do we make sense of it? What do we find legible? What do we find attractive? And here's just some differences, just to show again that there can, this is on the top is Johnson's sans serif, and this is on the bottom Gill's. But there are some differences, including the playful, like the diamonds on here. And he also was distinctive for putting an L. L's are problematic because they create that visual dazzle. Straight lines, they also look like eyes, like capital I's. They look like ones. There's, it's one of these problematic kind of letters. And then there's a kind of three really important fonts that kind of come out of that. I've talked about Gill's sans. There's Helvetica, which is probably the most famous font, and I should probably spend more time talking about Helvetica. In fact, one of the people here was reminding me that there's a great documentary film on Helvetica that can be seen, designed by a Swiss firm, Max Niedinger, and again captured the spirit of kind of modernism, being free from all the encumbrances of the past, all the serifs, and especially Futura that was designed. So they look, when you put them here, they don't look too different, and they're often used kind of interchangeably, but widely used. Helvetica is what, I'm sure you all know this, it's what on federal income tax forms. Almost all federal documents in which clarity is prioritized. Here, NASA uses Helvetica for their labeling on the space shuttle. I wanted to put up here, Richard Nixon had an interesting choice to make. Who was Nixon? Yeah, he's on here. Yeah, when they were, when they were trying to decide what to put on the moon as a plaque, and the debate was, what font do you use? What type speaks to the whole world, right? And that would be intelligible to distant waveforms, and so they chose Futura. There's a lot of debate between that and Helvetica. Some of them are on Castellan. And like Castellan is the Declaration, it's the Constitution, it's the most upright English font in the world. And then I just kind of point out that we're in a kind of a new, I think, kind of golden age of font design where there's a lot of things coming up, a lot of homages to earlier periods. So Obama made very popular Gotham font. He used it in all of his signage and stuff. It was based on, and this is what's becoming popular. They'll often take, this is the New York Port Authority bus terminal, but they'll often take an iconic sign from a Paris metro stop or from a bus stop or something that was designed not as a typeface, but as an actual sign, right? And they'll think, what could I do if I spun that out into a typeface and made something new? And so Gotham, it looked like it was going to take the world by storm. Twitter switched to Gotham for a little while, but then its users didn't like it, and so they switched back to Helvetica. But it's widely used now in a lot of catalogs. I'm trying to think of what's the movie? IKEA uses their logo and everything in it. But it's becoming a very popular, seemingly legible font. And I couldn't help but this campaign season enjoy watching the different signs, like Bernie had a very distinctive one, the little, is it a star? And he chose a particular font that actually Carlton uses. It's called Surveyor. I love this font. It's designed based on old maps. So if you ever look at an old map, you have to use all different typography to design cities versus states versus rivers. And so they have this rich array of different typographic conventions. And so a design firm created a font series called Surveyor. Like I said, Carlton uses it, and that's what Bernie's is in. So we have a lot of these kinds of, just in general, let me fast forward to there's all of this now on the web, easy to purchase and use kind of software that is allowing lots of people who don't run companies, they don't have to have gone to a design school to create their own fonts. And go online, there's fonts.com, there's a lot of font websites where you can get free fonts that are quite easy to install into if you have a computer and have, a word processing program. But it can be quite a lot of fun. You can go back and find old classics like Bimbo or Carlson or, Fraktur, if you want to write letters in that. But I tend not to be, there's some people that are pessimistic about how bad webs and in general the world of the kind of Twitterverse and things like that is in terms of losing these skills of handwriting, appreciation for print. I kind of see the opposite trend. This is one website I came across the other day. I really like this font. It's a brand new designed font based off a 16th century font called Ceylon. It was designed by, I think, a 26-year-old in Montreal that he just did on his computer. And I thought it was just graphically, and you might feel different, but I thought it was very nice. And I just in general see a whole array of possibilities with people. Even the fact that any of us can play with our own fonts and set text on a processor very quickly. And I think on mine I have something like 280 fonts loaded in there. So I can try it in all different things. So I see that as potentially leading us into a new, exciting age of typography. And a lot of these people who are interested are like me. They go back and they try to discover, well, what makes good type? And there's a lot of good books and documentaries and films. And I hope maybe I've conveyed a little bit of my interest in the subject and some of the things I've learned. So I'll stop there. So thank you.
I had no idea there was this much to learn about typeface. Isn't it fascinating? Thank you so much, Mike. And I'm sure this just scratched the surface. We have a certificate for you. Community Education Council, the CEC, gratefully acknowledges the volunteer efforts of Mike Guenther for presenting the bucket course, Do You Know Your Type? Thank you from all over.
And a beautiful black letter.
Next week, we have Jean Ketter talking about disability and being human. There will not be any small groups connected with that. I think she might have mentioned that last week. It will be a lecture style if you were concerned about that. And that will be starting next week for a 4-week course. And also I want to tell you that we need to leave the chairs up. So thank you anyway, but we don't need to put the chairs away.
They've taken the goodies away, so put your cups on the table.
They've taken the goodies away, so please put your cups on the table out there. I hope to see you all again next week. Thank you for coming this morning. Keep warm.